What was the background for you writing that book?
The immediate background was the birth of our twin sons in 1987. Until then, I had been the world's specialist for the gallbladder. The gallbladder is that small organ in our liver. And I wrote papers that were read with much interest by the world's 5 other specialists on the gallbladder. But when my sons were born, I realized that the future of their world does not depend upon gallbladders. It depends upon bigger issues. And that induced me to start writing about large issues of human societies, where humans came from, how we developed art, what's going to happen to us, what has happened to human societies. And so that first book of mine, The Third Chimpanzee, is dedicated to my twin sons who are now 27 years old.
Read your books!
All right. Oh, Discord. What's with Discord these days?
What's within?
No, the window keeps fucking up.
Oh.
On my OBS. Oh, well, it doesn't really matter. There's only 2 people here, so it's not a big deal.
Right.
Whatever. I'll just mess with my OBS. I don't know why, but every time I like Alt Tab. Recently, the Discord window fucks up. But that's okay. Today we're talking about Guns, Germs, and Steel, a often memed and contentious book. Funnily enough, I remember in my high school history class, it was just like a general history class, my teacher made us watch a sort of shortened documentary of the contents of Gun, Germs, and Steel, which wasn't in the curriculum. He just kind of added that on. And then he started like talking about like white guilt and shit. It was kind of weird. It kind of sticks out in my mind. But I've been introduced to the book before. I just never bothered reading it after that. I'm like, wow, it's kind of weird. And it felt to me like a bit too simplistic of an explanation. You know, there's like, oh, it's all everything's environment. Everything down to every reason is environment, and that's basically what this is. This is the author who has sort of studied in biology, anthropology, and history. Just sort of a learned guy. Not like he wasn't a professional historian by any means. When he embarked on this, he just sort of did the research, has some experience working in sort of indigenous populations and stuff like that. And then he wrote this book to try and his goal was to
answer Yali's question.
To smash racism, quoting fucking his goal was to smash racism, according to Sam Hyde. I don't know if he really accomplished that, but he answered Yali's question about, why are Europeans more advanced? And he set out to do that using only environmental factors. And he does a pretty good job of laying out the facts and information. It's a very dense book, tons of information in it. And for the most part, a lot of the information is factual. But you can tell, and I'm in the... All right, so the prologue, he's talking to his friend Yali. So he works in New Guinea with the indigenous populations there. And he's having a conversation with a local leader named Yali, and Yali asks Jared, all right, so why are like us, the New Guineans, so terrible at things, and why are the Europeans like flying around in airplanes? Why is that? And then so he set out to write this book to answer that question. But already in the prologue, he basically discards genetics, human genetics. He's like, they're like intelligence, IQ. What the fuck's that? He basically says IQ, schmyq.
Yeah, he's like, there's literature for it and there's literature against it, so we don't need to bother with it. It's
yeah. So it's honestly ridiculous, and this is the main problem of the book. It's he ignores completely any influence of human genetics on history, and even if you're like a completely dyed-hard, bleeding heart liberal who wants to help all these indigenous populations and the evil colonialists, you cannot deny that genetic pools and genetic and genes which developed from the environment had an influence on history. It might be a minor influence if you're on the more liberal side of things, but there is an influence. Jared sort of avoids talking about it at all. He sidesteps the entire issue. He often says, oh, well, it's not genes. He never actually backs up his statement. and this is after 400 pages, like the same thing.
Yeah, it gets tedious. I will just to play a little bit devil's advocate. It was written in the 90s, and the human genome wasn't sequenced until, was it 2003? But
Yeah.
even still, we still had genetic theory. It's not like genes weren't a thing
I mean,
back then.
you're right. There was a little bit less literature on. There's a lot less literature, I guess, that's more modernly accepted and not like being racist or eugenic on IQ and stuff. So now, basically, most modern psychologists, about 15 years after this book was published, all sort of agree that IQ is genetic. And so maybe when he was writing it, this didn't come into play. But I mean, there was still data sort of supporting this. And he completely discounts any possibility of genetic difference, and he goes to ridiculous lengths near the end of the book.
Yeah, it's pretty.
It's kind of silly, but which is funny because his whole hypothesis is that the different geography and the local flora and fauna, so the domesticatable animals, the plants available to each people is what determine their success. And those plants and animals are determined by genetics, and their genetics is an output of the environment. So it's like, all right, well, my whole argument hinges on the genetics of these plants and animals. We're just going to avoid the genetics of the humans.
Right. It's just, yeah. Like you said, he goes to ridiculous lengths on it over and over again.
Yeah, so after reading the prologue, I could already tell this book wasn't going to be like purely sort of distant science. So
I was angry after the prologue.
Yeah, I was like, wow, I thought it was going to be a lot worse than it was after reading the prologue. But I thought that upon reading it that, okay, so this guy's clearly biased in 1970. So he's writing the prologue from his story in 1972, and he then embarks on trying to write this book. And I can already tell, okay, so all of his research, everything is going to be biased towards this goal of explaining everything without touching human genetics ever. We're going to avoid it. He's already predisposed to the goofy idea that human genetics don't matter, like race is skin deep, that sort of thing. And so it's obviously not, even from the prologue, you can tell this is not going to be like a pure scientific book. And then if you read, at least the version I got, had like a bunch of like reviews from the New York Times echoes and stuff like that.
In the beginning
but
of
like,
it?
oh, this is like the greatest scientific achievement for his. I'm like, okay, yeah, it was a bit much. And so I expected after reading the prologue, so there's going to be some explanation of history, and then whenever anything that mildly might be explained by genetics comes up, he's going to like either brush over it or try to like sidestep it in a goofy way. And that's kind of
and he's always going to add the whole thing like, a white racist would think this, and this it's clearly wrong.
Yeah.
Because, and then yada yada yada.
See, he always adds smashing racism into his sentences. So yeah, and he in the prologue he flatly denies the existence of intelligence. He thinks IQ doesn't measure shit. He thinks it's not genetic at all. There's nothing to do with genetics and intelligence. Intelligence is just a meme made up by Westerners.
He literally also adds like Aboriginal Australians routinely master industrial technologies when given the opportunity to do so. Like that's not the case.
Yeah, we'll get into it into later chapters. But he was like, well, these New Guineans are just as smart as you and I. And then like,
like
by the way, before 1949 they were eating people. Like, all right, I guess that makes sense. All right, so that was the prologue, chapter 1. So the author begins with a sort of a basic overview of the human evolution archaeological evidence that he had back in the 90s when he was writing this, and it's been added to a bit, but it's mostly still the same. That we had Australopithecus and all these other primates in Africa, and then they molded into different types, and then eventually Homo sapiens and Neanderthals came about, and Homo erectus, and they all moved forward and started spreading around. And so he goes over mostly of that. And then just to update, so like his hypothesis sort of hinges on that for when he talks about America later in the book, that there were no there's nobody in America, no humans, or not a significant number of humans in America until 1200 BC. And now later archaeological evidence has sort of found that there were humans in even South America by 3500 BC. So
35,000.
35,000 years ago. Oh, people were immigrating, yeah.
Are you? Is that something you read? Because he does mention like some archaeologists finding that, and it was mainly bullshit.
Yes, but I watched some documentaries recently about current archaeological efforts, and there's been multiple sites in America of significantly older pre-Clovis sites, like 1300, 1400 kind of stuff. Censored chat. Jeff's become a lefty. Well, I've always had Top Chat on. I mean, I don't know. I guess there's no reason to really have Top Chat on, but just whatever. It's how it is. It's gonna stay like that. All right.
You're gonna smash the fash.
Smash live chat. I mean, I have live chat on a different window on my screen, so if you say anything in it, I'll read it. Don't worry about it. All right. So the author theorizes that so there's a bunch of megafauna in Australia, New Guinea, and America, and they were killed because all these humans came over from a different continent, and these animals have not evolved any. They've not evolved.
He mentions we don't know how they died.
We don't know how they died, but this is sort of his theory. Is that
that they died around the time we showed up.
That all the same time the humans showed up into the Americas is the same time all these animals went extinct, which makes sense. And the sort of the animals on the other continent have never seen humans. They don't have any like natural protections against human predators. They never had the select for that. And so you could just, like, similar to the dodo, you could just walk up to these animals and they were like, "Oh, what's a human?" And then they die. And this sort of, funnily enough, plays into later. So the Americas, New Guinea, and all these other places are depleted of these animals that perhaps could have been domesticated because they got killed by the early humans. And that really makes you think, huh? Why were all the animals killed in this particular area? But why are there like tons of them sitting around Eurasia and Asia and Europe?
Wow, that's so weird.
It's so weird that like there was an ecology still left in Europe and not those other places, despite humans being there. Kind of strange. All right.
Just gonna gloss over that one and not. Yeah, we're not racist.
Yeah. Yes, so he basically denies any influence of genetics on things. And it's all just environment and dumb luck. And that he said that it could have very well been any other continent if they had the right materials. And this is sort of his extra hypothesis that it's all based off geography and fauna and stuff.
Right, because I'd never thought of the whole north south versus east west axes of continents. Because that does have an effect on climate.
Oh well, yeah. One. So like yeah, because climate is much more consistent across latitudes, and if you look at the Americas and Africa, then you have a much smaller. You have a small latitude that's viable. Then you have a huge fuck ass desert, and then you have another latitude that's viable, and that's kind of the same for the Americas, where you have this terrible tropic area that's very hard to traverse. That sort of separated all the early civilizations, which is, and he's right in that geography barriers did play a part, but he sort of oversells it a lot. Because there's many examples that even when some of the civilizations he talks about where those geography barriers were kind of irrelevant, like people were just going far across the sea in fucking antiquity. And so that wasn't really the big deal because you could still go up and down the coasts of America if you wanted to trade things. It just didn't really happen. It didn't happen for other reasons.
It's the crops that's the big the fact that you can't move plants too far away from where they usually grow. I mean, that's at least one of the big factors.
that yeah, like if you're a basic civilization, it's much harder to move like you move like a couple 100 miles and you plant some plants and you pick up and leave and go keep going another 100 miles. And if you have a consistent environment, then yeah, you can keep planting and replanting, and then it eventually migrates to new civilizations. That's how people shared their crops. So chapter 2, he sort of talks about a sort of little case study. So there was.
I like this chapter.
Yeah,
this is one of the chapters that was really actually interesting to read.
Yeah, so in New Zealand there were two indigenous populations: the Maori, which I'm sure you've heard of, the sort of the chest beating, Kiwi kind of Maori guys, and then there's the Moriori, who are basically genetically completely the same to them, and the Maori settled a more geographically rich in agriculture area. And then the Moriori didn't have much resources, so they were just sort of hunter-gatherer nomads on their little island. And then in 1835, the Europeans are down in New Zealand, and then the Europeans get say, oh well, hey, we saw these Moriori guys over on this island, and the Maori catch wind of this and are like, oh shit, and so they buy some European guns and they paddle over there and they just fucking kill everybody.
Yes, you do.
And so the Maori, which had a much more sort of competitive environment with a lot more food and population density, were more violent. And then they went over to their peaceful little nomadic neighbors living on their island and killed them all. And then the Moriori, when the Maori arrived, were like, oh, hey, don't kill us, we'll be friends. And didn't work out.
They wanted a peaceful solution, but they didn't have time to talk to them. They just were just killed instantly. I like the quote from the guy too. It's like we went over there and did according to our customs. It was just all normal.
Yeah, it was a victory royale.
Right.
And so I think in this specific case where you have people that are very close genetically, just on different environments, and then one has a society and the other attacks it, then yeah, his hypothesis does hold true that it's well the environment, the fertility of the land, and like what crops you have and how much calories you can output to sustain like extra people so you can organize a military determines how successful your society is. And that's pretty much true. And the Maori were able to shit on the Moriori because of this. And so I don't disagree with that. But he definitely starts stretching it more and more throughout the book.
Oh yeah.
All right, so he then, after he talks about the Maori attacking the Moriori, he goes on about some other different little independent civilizations. I wouldn't really call them that, but that's just my opinion.
No, well, they're just spread out. Like, I looked at the map of the Polynesian islands, and I was like, what the? There's people living out there on those rocks? Mm-hmm. Like, I'd never figured that.
There was the Tonga civilization in Hawaii were the most successful, where they had the highest food, and they had organized like chiefdom civilizations where they had a hierarchy, and they went over and conquered other places near to them, but they never developed like advanced technology or writing or any of these things.
No, there was one proto empire among all of those. I'm pretty sure he mentioned towards the end of it, but it was most of this chapter was just different cases of how all these little islands were vastly different from
the archipelago of all the different Polynesian islands give you a good case study. Like, okay, so this population had this sort of like thing going on. They had this amount of food. They had this population density. So they formed a chiefdom that farmed. This other island had like sparse stuff on it. So the population was purely hunter-gatherer and just gathering food and did not bother farming because there was not enough land to do so. And so on. He just uses this, these archipelagos, a perfect case study. Everyone's like a little tiny experiment on their little island.
Like
sure,
a set of little petri dishes, yay.
Yeah. And so he just sort of goes over all these different things. And if you want to read the book, I guess this is one of the more interesting chapters in the book where he talks about the different histories of Tonga and Hawaii and all the Polynesian islands and the Maori. And the different islands, and there's like one island that's like really small but has a bunch of people on it because they perfected terrace farming. It was pretty interesting. All right, so
Definitely, at this point, I got the sense that the book was not a waste of time to read, but then again, at the later chapters, it just became.
oh yeah,
Ugh.
well, I mean, it sort of descends, I think, in quality as you get closer to the end.
Oh yeah, yeah, because the fourth part,
The
the
last
last
few
five
chapters
chapters, yeah,
sort
yeah,
of
those.
are an
Uh,
oof. All right, so chapter 3 is the Spanish conquest of the Incas. And so he goes over all the very colorful descriptions of the Spanish that they wrote when they they was walked into Incan territory and slapped their shit. Uh,
that
and
was pretty
and
cool.
he sort of like settles on, oh, it was the steel weapons and the armor and the horses, which is true. The steel weapons, the armors, and the horses did allow them to sort of have a shock and awe first attack, take the king hostage, and then this allowed them to get high leverage for their further operations later. But
Well,
the
specifically, the first case was also the germs. That no, oh, wait, no, it was the Civil War. He
yeah,
was
so
taking
it was at
advantage of the
the
fact
Incans
that
just finished the Civil War, and then the
right.
Spanish swing by and they go and see the leader, and the Incan leader's like, oh hey, what's up guys, and then, and then the Spanish like set an ambush and take him hostage and kill like a shit ton of nobles and stuff.
Yeah, well, they did it because he threw away the Bible. He didn't want Jesus, and
Yeah,
so
so
he
like
had to.
the Catholic missionary, I'm sure Leo would love this. The Catholic missionary walks up
Right.
to the Incan king and hands him a Bible, and the king opens it and looks at the letters like, "Fuck this shit, I can't read," and then and then the priest is like, "Kill them all," and then they do.
And then they do.
Yeah, yeah,
It's pretty good.
pretty good. The uh and then he talks about how the Spaniards' success came from both the weapons and then germs, and so the a slave or a few other people who were traveling with the Spanish infected the American continent. And supposedly, I haven't looked into the numbers into this. I need to. I would have to look into specific studies, like what were the actual populations of the Incans and the Aztecs, and how many people did actually die. Because it kind of reeks of the whole, the fucking
He says
Muggerwillian thing.
95% of them
Yeah,
at some point in the book was wiped out with it. That's a lot.
it seems a little much. Um, but yeah, that supposedly smallpox sort of eradicated the majority of the remaining population, which made demoralized any sort of counterattack by the Incans or the Aztecs. And then he talks about, oh well, they had writing, so they were able to do things like planning and forethought.
Right, but the freaking Incas had that too. Was it? It
No,
was
the
the
Incans didn't
right?
have any writing.
Oh, there was one of those
The
empires.
Mesoamerican. I don't think the Aztecs. Maybe I think the Aztecs.
It was either the Aztecs or the Incas had some
No,
writing.
the Aztecs did. The Incans didn't have any writing.
Right. Okay.
Mesoamerica,
So yes, yeah.
Mexico did.
Right.
Anyways, I agree with his conception. Okay, so these guys walk in, they have better technology, they get a good ambush, they have germs on the back, and so they manage to sort of overcome this very populated and primitive empire by the good luck of germs. But then I just can't say that it's the. I mean, yeah, guns are a good force multiplier, and so are horses. But you can't take over a million people with some guns and horses if it's like 100 to like a 10, if it's 1 to 100, it doesn't matter. Like it's relatively minor in the geopolitical situation until it gets adopted by the native people, or they just outnumber them. And so he also talks about this later in the chapter, that it was basically the Spanish got the reputation of being strong, and then all the people who were on the other side of the Civil War are like, oh, okay, we're gonna join the Spanish and help them out.
Join the winning side.
So it was much less that, oh well, the tiny detachment of Spaniard inquisitors of steel weapons was able to have like 1,000 KD ratio and just like slaughter Indians. And certainly they killed a lot of them. But they got the local powers on their side. It was purely opportunistic, and it's kind of harder to sort of fault the sort of narrative of like, oh, the super technological alien smashing, because they needed the assistance of like half the Incan Empire to help them actually maintain and defeat it. So, all right, chapter 4. He talks about the type of animals and crops available to different civilizations, and this is sort of the crux of his whole book, is that the plants in Europe were way better than the plants anywhere else, and there couldn't possibly have been domesticated any as good plants in other places. And he sort of goes on and on about like if this is a fair claim that like the native peoples explored every possible domestication, and then he talks about how even in modern times it's not like we get new fruits or vegetables from all the wild plants that are sitting out there. But I think that's more of like an economic crowding out effect than a true sort of. It's not like people are trying to go through like a century-long process of engineering some random wild plant into something that's like slightly worse than old rice, right? Like there's no reason to. And so I would have to challenge his assertion that, oh, well, even our modern scientists can't make a crop that's like relevant. Sure, they can do like gene splicing, but there's not a crop that's relevant like rice or wheat. Well, no shit, because rice and wheat took thousands of years to develop, and has like tons of people working on it all the time, and gives you a ton of nutrition. So why would you bother trying to start from scratch of like other random plants? So I don't think there's like a huge industry of plant scientists going around trying to engineer like wild plants into just fresh types of new unseen edibles. I don't think that's happening.
It's just no benefit in doing
There's no reason to do it. And then right. he even talks about this as like a reason later in the book. So like there were other types of wheat, other types of flax and barley all across Asia, but the sort of the ones that started in Mesopotamia spread out all over Asia and Europe. And so there's no reason to bother trying to domesticate the other ones, because we already had a domesticated one. So if you look at like
someone figured it out,
yeah,
and then
if you look at modern wheat, it's like the same wheat that from that one place, and everybody all across the entire Europe and Asian continent used it. And they didn't bother trying to make like wheat number 2 or wheat number 3 because they had one already. And so if that's the case, then why can you say that we've not? There just isn't a possibility that there's just domesticatable plants sitting around that would be high yield.
I mean, the only case that would be Australia, which does not have a lot of plants that would have. Yeah, but at least in the Americas, they had plenty of fucking plants to play with.
Yeah, so chapter 4, it's mostly just a brief. He only briefly touches on the sort of the concept of like the plants, and then he talks a bit about the animals.
Yeah, the animal part I found quite interesting.
Yeah,
I mean, there's a few things there I didn't know about. I didn't know cypress wood was hard to domesticate. I thought it just didn't try, but I still think it could have been done.
Well, yeah, and that's another thing. So he talks about, oh, well, the Europeans and the Asians, I mean, the cows and the pigs and the dogs and the horses, they just walked up and they're like, oh, whoa, we got fucking dogs in now. And no, that's not how it happened. Like, he talks about how the ancestors of all these animals were pretty, like, much bigger and more wild and dangerous, right? Like they were the aurochs, were the ancestors of the cows, and there's much larger sort of bovines with huge horns and stuff that are much harder to domesticate. So I imagine that it took thousands of years of cohabitation and effort on parts of the Europeans to turn these animals into actually domesticatable. They'd have to like tame them for hundreds of years before that was even possible. So I think, and that's another thing. Like, so like the time scale that all of these. It's like, oh, well, all modern day domestication of zebras has failed. Well, I mean, well, yeah, we've just started only, 50 years ago? It takes thousands of years to get genetic changes significant enough to domesticate an animal, right? if it's like freshly wild.
Not necessarily thousands, but at least over 100.
It depends on the
You can't
animal
do it
too.
in 50. Yeah, because
Yeah,
I
you can't do
remember
it in 50.
reading about domestication of foxes in Russia. The Soviets had an experiment, and they've not completely domesticated a fox, but it was, what was it, 5 generations of breeding them in cages, just breeding out the ones that would snap at humans. That was pretty successful. But that was still like zebras in 50 years. No, not gonna happen.
Yeah, you need a concerted high effort, and you got to do it repeatedly. And there's not really been like a serious effort to do it. And I imagine back in the antiquity, the people took them much longer. They didn't have all the animal science and veterinary stuff, and they just had to like wing it and tame the zebras and hope they fuck, or and that's probably how all the modern pig, the modern cow came about, because wild boars are fucking nasty. It's not like it just became the domesticated pig. They had to be tamed and bred for quite a while before that was possible. So
they did do that in a lot of the other civilizations too, though. They had the pigs.
Well, I mean, the pigs were being spread from different places. But yeah. But it was mainly... But that's the thing, right? Like, so if you look at where does all this stuff originate that's, like, significant, then it's basically in Eurasia, and that's it. And then, like, the South Americans get alpacas or something, but it's not nearly as significant as the sort of a number of domesticated stuff in Eurasia. And that's sort of the crux of his hypothesis, that all these other places like America and Australia and Africa, they just didn't have any animals. They just could not till their fields.
Cards was stacked against them. Boo-hoo.
Yeah. All right, so chapter 5, he talks about, he talks about a theoretical counterpoint to him, that, okay, so why isn't South Africa, California, and sort of Central America heavily farmed despite being like super good for farming? And then he basically says, oh, well, they just didn't have any crops. That's basically his rebuttal.
Well, no cattle to
do it. But that's the thing, right? Like in order, the cattle in Europe developed from aurochs, which are these nasty wild animals, probably over thousands of years. It was a concerted effort, and I'm sure like if a similar effort was probably put forth for the bisons, then maybe it could have happened for bisons too.
Because his argument is that the bison is just a huge beast that will kill you.
Yeah, but the auroch is too.
Yeah, exactly.
The ancestor of the cow.
The same problem, and we
saw the wolf's not a nice. It's fucking big ass.
No.
Yeah, I think he sort of hand waves away the mechanics of domestication. He just sort of says, "Oh well, the animals just became domesticated because it's in their nature." And I definitely don't think that's the case. And I'd have to read more up on the subject, but I think that's one of the flaws in sort of his central hypothesis. All right, so he in chapter 5 he sort of covers those different areas: the South Africa, Eastern America, and there's one other area I'm forgetting. But he looks at and Australia, and he looks at the different flora available, and is like, oh well, we did an analysis, and there's just nothing there, nothing that could be domesticated, and they just all they had were like sunflowers and stuff.
Which wasn't the case. They had corn.
Well, I mean, corn came later from Mexico or
right.
Eastern America, but they had to adapt corn because corn wasn't native to the climate, because it's a tropical, or at least traditionally was a tropical crop, and had to be adapted for a cold environment. That's why it took a while. Which just sort of ties back into his other hypothesis that the sort of east-west latitude climate coherence let everybody like take the wheat from Mesopotamia and grow it everywhere else, and that was like so easy and great. And that's why European Asian societies were so advanced. which is fair.
I mean, it is a point to bring up that I mean, it was definitely an effect of some sort, but it wasn't easy. I don't believe.
Yeah, but I think a more telling, besides the sort of prehistory stuff with like super early civilizations, yeah, I can definitely see the geographical influence on that. What about the difference between why isn't India the sort of political power of the world? They received the same crops at the same time as Europe and Asia. Why did the Chinese succeed where the Indians failed? Why were the Indians so divided and such, or had like lower technology for so many years, and they get conquered by invading Muslims? It just it sort of it doesn't explain all of history. It fits very cleanly when you go into this sort of BC era where you have all these like hunter gatherers, and it's very simple at that point. But it starts to break away when you get into later history at a number of areas. So, Chapter 6, Diamond tries to reason how the transition from hunter-gatherer to farmer happened as plant technology spread in around 8500 BC. And his phrasing of it's like so stupid. He's like, well, they just sort of unconsciously started becoming farmers. Like they just planted stuff and then they settled down afterwards, which maybe, I guess, but I'm thinking that before there were agrarian societies, that people had planted things before and they knew how to plant things. They just didn't like stick around all the time around their planted things. And then maybe somebody came up with the idea of sticking around their planted things and really digging in, like camping, basically. Camping in Fortnite, if you will.
Right. It was the switch to sedentary lifestyles. So,
yeah. And I think him saying that it's just they unconsciously switched to a sedentary lifestyle. Maybe not. I don't know. I think that would be hard to say. So he sort of relies on this mimetic model. So that people accidentally stumbled upon farming, and then the knowledge just spread. And that's kind of true. But it also, the different types of farming and different crops arose independently in China and Europe. So there was the Fertile Crescent, but there were independent crops in the west of Europe, and then there were independent crops in Asia. There were different millets, rices, things like that, besides the wheat that came from Mesopotamia. And it sort of, well, okay, is it a meme spreading, or is it that these people have the ability to do the pattern recognition to actually domesticate plants? You know?
Yeah, because I mean, it was it brings up one case study of someone who didn't figure out the pattern recognition there. The Aboriginals in Australia, they would they would dig out certain tubers and cut off most of the root and then put them back in the ground and let them grow back. But all they had to do was just to bring the damn things home to camp and grow them there. But they left them in the ground when they found them, when they were out hunting and gathering.
Yeah, and he's like, well, if only the Aboriginals had like 4,000 years, they'd be at like 9,000 BC technology. I'm like, all right.
Yeah, which no, they went back in time at some point too. So it's no.
Poor Aboriginals.
Well, yeah, they are poor.
Yeah, I think it's kind of ridiculous that he says it's unconscious, right? Because like making the decision to change your lifestyle to like a completely sedentary lifestyle based around a singular crop supplanted by nearby food is like you gotta plan that.
You gotta coordinate with people.
And I think honestly, a good companion book to this was that military history book we read, from the Stone Age to Alexander.
Right.
Because it talks about a lot of how Arthur Thrill's hypothesis is that the earliest societies rose out of military needs, and then farming came after. That basically people were tired of getting raided by other tribes and shit, and so they built fortifications. They're like, oh well, we have fortifications, so let's build crops, and then they have crops and fortifications, so they have states.
That is the argument he actually brings
Yes.
later in the book too, where he kind of shits on Rousseau's social concept.
Yeah. Diamond later also sort of agrees that it was military action that formed the first states. I think
competition between neighbors.
Yes, that one tribe conquers another, then becomes bigger and more centralized, and so on until a state forms, which I think is a fair model. I mean, that's kind of how it works if you play EU4. So I think that's pretty big-brained of him to say.
Yeah, it's good.
All right. And so, yeah, he has this sort of weird saying, okay, so the people, they stumbled upon the wheat, and then they started sedentary lifestyle, and then it spread from Mesopotamia all across Europe and Asia, and that sort of kick-started agriculture, and there was these different origins of agriculture. So you had like the Chinese, the West Europe, and the Mesopotamian, and they all like traded with each other, and then all the crops spread around, and so forth. And here he talks about, okay, so later they started cultivating olives and grapes, and then finally tree plants like apples and pears around the early time of the Greeks, so like 800, 1000 BC-ish, is when tree plants finally came around.
Yeah, because that was because it was a lot more complicated.
Yeah, a lot more complicated, and sort of the tree grafting had to fly over from China at some point too. The concept of tree grafting.
Yeah, because or else it's just too variable to actually do it as a production. Just fruit trees.
What are people saying in chat? Ruthless Jeff closes and cap eyes while whispering, "Don't worry, nobody will remember you." What the heck? What are you talking about, Dwarf? All right, I guess.
Zhao was saying earlier that you'll eventually you'll give up on this channel and then they'll take down Leo Cult. That's aggressive.
I guess. Well, I mean, if I stop reading books, which I don't think I will.
Right, me neither.
I don't care if like nobody watches. I just want to read books. This is just this isn't really a production of a show. This is just to motivate me to read a book every week.
Yeah, and I took advantage of that because I'm doing the same thing. This is a great way to fucking digest the content of
to give yourself a deadline,
dumb book like this,
and
give yourself a deadline, and then talk about it with someone who read it. It's good.
All right, chapter 7. Diamond talks about the evolutionary process by which domesticated plants came about, and how this sort of the unconscious genetic engineering of early humans. He's like, oh, well, they picked the best plants, and then they ate them, and they shat them, and then when they in their poo-poo toilets, the plants popped up.
The latrines got green.
The latrines were the earliest farms. Which I guess.
That was pretty funny.
But yeah.
I mean, it's true to some extent. Definitely. Also, the stuff with the peas, like the only peas they could gather were the ones that were mutated to the point where they didn't spring out or jump out of the pea pods.
And the same with wheat, is the ones that didn't fall off were the ones that got harvested.
Right.
So it's just sort of this natural synergy between the mutation of wheat and peas and the domestication of the plants.
Yeah, he brings up this what was it? The fact that most of the plants have evolutionary. It's mostly evolutionary strategies to keep animals from eating them, and then eventually the mutations of those genes turn out to be their benefit because they would be promulgated by humans.
Yeah. So the plants that were more human centric ended up getting more genetically human-centric, and part of this was also because the early farmers would just like throw a bunch of seeds at one place and then water them, and then the competition would raise the softest, easiest to grow seed pod, and so that then as time went on, all the plants became easier to grow because only the ones that were the easiest to sort of trigger sprouting were the ones that won out between all the different seeds in the ground. So sort of accidentally, they had all these different selection processes going on before sort of a more advanced farming and botany came around.
Catalyzed by humans.
Yeah. So
I didn't know wild almonds was poisonous though. That was the kind of
how to make an
What
almond?
was it 12? How to eat 12 wild almonds and you die
Yeah,
because Nazi gas
because
chambers.
almonds have cyanide in them, but if they're
Right.
wild, apparently. So, and I think in this chapter he talks about like when the different crops around the world were domesticated and how. And then he also sort of continues on his hypothesis that obviously at this point there were no other crops that could have been domesticated in these areas. Despite like the domestication of plants coming thousands of years later in America and Australia, or well, I guess never happening in Australia, but becoming thousands of years later in Africa.
It was the northern part, and then some of this southwestern part. It was very very little in Australia.
And Africa actually had farming for quite a long time. They were just kind of low yield, and I guess the main problem with Africa was animals, which is kind of what he says, but he doesn't really explain it very well. I don't think he has a good theory for Africa.
No, I mean he brings up a few animals that really sounds like they would have been impossible to domesticate. What was it? Some of the
hippos and rhinos, of course not.
Yeah, exactly. And the freaking what was the antelopes or whatever they're called?
Yeah,
the little tiny ones.
Gazelles.
Yeah. Gazelles. Right. That would have been and the cheetahs as well. Yeah, what was it? There was some king.
The Egyptians were trying to tame cheetahs for hunting and because it was like cool and they loved cats.
Yeah, that was pretty funny to hear. The guy who had what was it? 400 cheetahs. That was cool.
Yeah. And so I think just on that point that if the ancient people didn't find any crops, they must not be there. But I think it's more so that how the sheer efficiency of modern crops means nobody is bothering to try and go through the intensive process of making new, less efficient crops when they're trying to compete with thousands of years of human selection on these certain crops, right?
Right.
And that's kind of also why people didn't bother doing wheat number 2 and wheat number 3 is because they already have all they need.
Yeah, it's what did you call it? It's you don't yield. I mean, the amount of work that would go into making a wheat 2 the amount of work that would go into it was just not pay back.
Yeah, and he doesn't really try to make a timeline for like, okay, so people were eating wheat, but how long until they had enough of a domesticated wheat to actually use? Like how long was that time period? He doesn't try to make that archaeological claim.
No, and we can also only guess about it because it's all based on that sketchy archaeological digging.
Yeah,
which he criticizes too throughout the book.
Sure, yeah. He definitely doesn't rely completely on carbon dating, and he gives it a good leeway for his dates, which I appreciate. Chapter 8, he talks about the logistics of domestication, and goes to great lengths to ever imply that people's intelligence could have led to different domestication efforts being successful. So he's basically like, well, it's just like the wheat and the peas are just like piss easy. All the other shit that's so hard, like potatoes are apparently fucking difficult.
Poop.
You know?
Yeah, it's not a very good argument, but
yeah, and he lists a number of examples where previously domesticated plants sat around and they were not domesticated by their nearby populations, and then they became supplanted by the then engineered wheat from Mesopotamia. And he sort of makes this argument that the Middle East had easier crops than anywhere else. That the wheat that stays up and the pea pods that don't pop, that's like the easiest shit. Which I don't know. Like isn't potatoes easy as fuck? I mean, I guess there's like a processing that has to go with potatoes.
Yeah, it depends on the early potatoes, but I've grown potatoes. It's not hard.
Potatoes are like one of the easiest. Like tubers. And he talks about how like tubers sustain a lot of societies he talks about, like yarrow tubers and
you get a lot of calories,
other
things. Very little work.
Yeah, and they had like the Polynesian societies. They had pigs and they had tubers, and they had a decent diet, supplemented by like local berries and stuff. And so I don't think there is really a reason why they couldn't have developed at that point. All right.
Yeah, I'm trying. I can't even remember this chapter too much. I guess I didn't leave too much of a
Impression. Well, he talks about how they were looking at different sites of early Mesopotamian
the early
farmers,
species.
and they found 157 types of seeds in an archaeology site. And then, but like if you find a collection of 157 seeds that are almost all useful to humans, gathered in one place, you would think that maybe it's a concerted effort to try and start fucking agriculture. It's not like unconscious. Maybe that indicates some sort of conscious, intelligent effort to make farming work. I don't know.
We just don't know, Jeff.
We just don't know. It was just unconscious. They just stumbled into farming. All right. And he just uses a lot of deductive reasoning all throughout the book. So he's like, oh well, there must not be any nutrient-bearing crops in New Guinea, and all these New Guineans know all about the crops, but they just haven't grown any.
Well, then some of the New Guineans did grow crops, though.
Well,
that's the thing. Yeah.
Some of them did,
because they even grow their own crops still. So I found that interesting that even our crops, when we started colonizing them, that they still subsist off of their own crops and their own.
Well, that's because they're better adapted to the environment.
Exactly. So that was a little interesting. That's later though. So.
What about mushroom farming? Whenever I read this, I was like, why don't they farm mushrooms?
I'm
no botanist.
Mushrooms are fucking poisonous as fuck.
Well, yeah,
that's very sketchy. That requires a lot of trial and error.
You've got time. It's not like your civilization's going anywhere.
Right, but then people have to sometimes die for the trials.
Well, that's what he relates his story about how they found the good mushrooms that they could eat. Like they found a mushroom that grows on a tree. Why didn't they try to cultivate that mushroom in tree mushroom farms? I don't know.
I guess I'm
not a botanist, so I don't know how easy it is to grow mushrooms. I imagine it's doable.
It's weird. I know friends who've grown psilocybin mushrooms, but it's like you do them in a plastic box, and it's very weird.
Well, you need caves and stuff.
Yeah, so I don't think it would be that easy.
You cut off a log, and then you put it in a damp cave, and then you put the spores on it, right? What else is there to do?
Maybe. Again, I don't know either.
I don't know either, but
I've eaten some mushrooms, fly amanita.
I mean, I guess that probably wouldn't be the fastest growing yield, if you really think about it, though. I guess it wouldn't be that useful, but it would definitely supplement your food.
A lot of calories, but yeah.
Anyways,
I think it would be a hard one to really to do large scale food production on, because we don't even do it now. We have.
we have industrial mushroom farms.
Yeah, we do actually. Yeah, never mind.
What do you think mushrooms at the store are?
Well, yeah, I was trying to, because we have different names for the mushrooms here, so we don't have that many in the store, but we champignon. What the fuck do you call that thing?
I don't know. I guess I'd have to. I don't think it's a fair criticism because I just don't know enough about farming and botany.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
And then he talks about North America, how they didn't really have any useful North American plants. Well, they had apples; they just were not able to domesticate them. But I guess that's reasonable because
that was the tree grafting.
Yeah, that's reasonable because it wasn't until after I think in the middle of Bronze empires then we were able to do tree grafting. So I think it's more reasonable that the Indians did not. I think the title of the chapter is Indians or apples. Were the Indians retarded, or were the apples too good? I think it's a little bit of both.
It's a little bit of both.
A little bit of column A, a little bit of column B.
If you ever planted an apple tree, you'll know that it's very 50-50 whether or not it'll be something you can actually get a good yield out of. The grafting definitely is an important factor in doing large scale food production with fruit trees.
All right. Chapter 9, he talks about. This is the one where he defends how the zebra is like really hard to tame. I think we've already talked about some of the criticism of that. Like he says, "Oh well, zebras they just bite people. They're just not. They just don't have the mentality." But I'm like, did aurochs have the mentality?
Well, I thought
like wolves
the
have
little
the
thing that was funny though that he mentioned American cowboys trying to use their
lassos and the zebra like just dodge that shit.
Yeah, it's a zigzag out of it. That was pretty funny. But the biting and not letting go, that was kind of scary to hear.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you're like it's a bit more dangerous in Africa, so maybe they have different temperaments that would have to be harder to domesticate. So maybe that's fair. But I think it's still definitely possible.
It's possible to tame them. I mean, you can even look at the picture Ospin in the Discord.
Hold on. Let me grab that picture and I'll put it on screen just for memes. Hold on.
Right. He does mention that scenario.
He mentions in the book when that picture happened. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought it was pretty funny though. The whole argument he lays out in this chapter, he likens it to the passage from Anna Karenina. Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. I mean, he does do somewhat of a good job as to, like, at least lay the groundwork for why some animals are easier to domesticate than others. But just
but it's kind of like base level stuff. But to be fair, he does cover a lot of different topics in this book, and so it's not like he is like an expert on all of them.
Right, it's very wide.
Yeah.
Very wide.
But just basically the same criticism that I think it would be very hard to claim that ancestral horses, pigs, and cows were just rosy-eyed, super easy, just tap them on the back and domesticate them. I think they had to have a pretty long selection process, go from auroch to cow, and they must have been living with humans for a while.
It did not happen overnight.
Yes.
Snow
and sort of the where his reasoning falls flat. He's always like, oh well, all these native peoples in the other countries, they just didn't domesticate everything, so that means there was nothing that's possible to domesticate ever. It's just like it's post facto reasoning. It doesn't really get at the root of the issue, right?
Right. And also, if you turn back the time a little bit, the fact that they managed to eradicate all the at least a lot of the larger species,
all the larger species in America and Australia and New Guinea were killed by the humans around 1300 BC, and mysteriously they were not killed by the humans in Europe. It's kind of strange. I don't know. There's got to be a reason why that happened, right? He never touches on that reason. He never talks about that one.
He's like, oh, it's suspicious that it was around the same time that people showed up, and then kind of keeps moving forward from there.
Yeah. All right, so it's sort of like an apples and oranges argument. So it's like, oh well, if the people in Africa adopted all the European animals, then there was nothing in Africa that was domesticatable. I don't think that's a good argument. It's not particularly logical. But I mean, I'd have to ask like some biologist that's much more versed in the field of like theoretical domestication, right? To actually,
right.
Someone who's really studied.
It is
that.
Also, I mean, I'm looking at the table in the book of how many species there were, as candidates for, at the very least, for Australia. They did not have a lot of animals to work.
Yeah, you can't really ride a kangaroo.
I mean, it'd be a hell of a ride, but no, you can't. But then we go back to the whole they eradicated the big species before that point, anyways, because the candidates he derives from for the table is he lays out a bunch of specific specifications that the animals would have to exhibit. And
yeah, and I think this is sort of a fault in his own research that he's like, oh, well, obviously then cows, horses, and goats and pigs had this trait where they're easily mentally dominatable. And that this was always the case, and humans just like walked up to them and domesticated them. I think it was more complicated than that.
Yeah.
And then he
Pretty
sort of
much this-
uses the point that in modern times and we've already talked about this again and again, but the
he repeats himself in the book too.
Yes.
You could cut this down to cut 200 pages out of
yeah,
this
you
book
definitely
and still
probably
have
could
all the
cut
info.
200 pages and get like the same information. He goes on a lot of tangent chapters as well later on.
Yeah, it's bad.
He sort of says that, oh, well, there's not really any new domesticated, even with all of modern science, we can't domesticate any new animals in Africa. I'm like, is there really been an effort? It's only been 50 years. And if there is an effort, is it funded on the same scale as European domestication efforts when it was like pre-civilization where it was like super fucking important? Like now it would just be like a novelty. There's not really a reason to bother really try hard domesticating zebras, right?
No, exactly.
I mean, it would be like a luxury good, like owning a zebra that's domesticated, like just like the foxes in Russia. Like the only thing they could really use it for is like, oh, you want to buy an expensive Russian luxury domesticated fox? Like that's about it.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, you can't buy zebra meat. At least I've heard. Wait, I've tried zebra. Never mind. But yeah, there would be no big benefit out of it. It's really not economically viable. If you were to scale it up, probably.
Yeah.
Because it would just be beat out by all the other animals.
And it's the same with crops. It's why would you bother trying? Like it probably took a few thousand years to get from wild wheat to wheat that is carried in Eurasia, around Asia and Europe, and used. It would probably take, even with all of our modern technology, a couple hundred years to get even to like that baseline with a wild plant, just because of how long it takes to cultivate and all the genetics and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, with plants, we can at least speed things up quite a bit.
Yeah.
Because we have the technology to do so, but especially with animals, it would.
With
be,
animals,
it
it's
would,
much longer.
It takes many generations, and and especially because a lot of animals just don't. Well, not a lot, but he mentions this in the chapter too, that some animals just don't breed under captivity.
Yeah, that is, and also a true point. But I'm sure that like aurochs didn't breed. I keep bringing up aurochs, but I find it hard to believe that all of these animals were just conveniently had all these traits. I think they were tamed. He talks about the difference between taming and domestication. How there's many animals like elephants are tamed. They're not really domesticated, not bred in captivity. They're not like genetically modified. And then cheetahs were tamed by Egypt in small number.
Right, but the cheetah specifically, they had the roadblock that what was it? Their mating ritual was the males would chase a female for like hundreds of miles.
In order for a cheetah to mate, you have to have like an entire like multi-acre land for them to run on.
Yeah, this is the only way that the female cheetah would ovulate, which is pretty funny that she needs to be chased for hundreds of miles in order for her fucking baby factory to start warming up.
It's pretty funny, yeah. But yeah, not to harp on the aurochs, but I think he sort of simplifies the domestication of animals specifically in the Eurasian continent a bit too much. And then and for plants, he uses sort of a post facto explanation that isn't really sufficient in explaining things. But I don't think that's like the main problem of the book. I think the domesticated animals and the geography arguments, I think they're fair enough. I think they actually hold mostly. I think when he really falls away is when he's talking about sort of the reason why these things happened. You know?
Yeah, his
and
conclusions
then later history.
and reasoning is
and his sort
very
of
biased.
His desperate sort of avoidance of the topic of human genetics at all turns.
Right.
So chapter 10, the author talks about how all right, so we talked about it earlier as well, just because it was relevant. the Europe goes east to west, has a coherent latitude. The temperature and the day cycle and the weather is mostly, well, it varies, but it's large part the same. Going from like Europe to China, like you can farm in a line from Europe to China, barring a few like mountains and deserts and stuff. And so this gave a huge competitive sort of ecosystem of people living and farming, competing, and technology and stuff that led to the best civilizations there. And you sort of have South America and North America, where very puzzling. You have the Andes, where you have the alpacas and the potatoes, and they never go north. They just like potato never reaches America or North America. The Indians never get it. It just sticks up on there in the mountain. Nobody bothers to bring it down. And I think that's more of like a. So I'm sure they had some method of preserving potatoes for a decent amount of time. And
I think potatoes can last quite a while.
And
but
yeah,
again, travel was very slow back then, so they would have to.
Yeah, but even with like a rudimentary boat, you could travel not that slowly up the coast, up or down the coast to a different civilization. It was kind of remarkable that the Aztecs and the Incans lived like about 1,000 miles away from each other and didn't know each other existed.
Yeah, that was pretty funny too.
Like the Aztecs and the Incans just did not know each other existed. And I think that's actually less the sort of, it was just geography. I think that was more of a cultural thing. Of
spread out.
Because they had very centralized, almost, I don't want to say hive mind, but very, they
had pretty complex societies.
They had a complex society with a very sort of rigid social structure. And it's not like they're encouraging random slaves or people to fuck off to the random edges of the empire, right? That they want the human labor in the field, making the food, giving it to the king, making the sacrifices, making the gold. They want all that happening. They don't want people just screwing around and running off, you know?
Yeah, and they're not interested in what's outside. It's just like they want to cultivate their own little bubble of god worship. I don't know.
Yeah, and he sort of argues that, well, America had a late start. It was like 1300 BC, while humans were in Europe and Africa for millions of years. Which I guess, but he also doesn't really explain why the Bantu. I mean, we'll get to that later. Never mind.
Yeah.
So he talks about how historically the sort of the north-south barriers, the jungles, the tiny peninsulas, all that stuff, the rivers, led to like this huge lack of trade of plants and animals between the Mesoamerican Aztecs, the Incans, and then the North American Native Americans. And he's like, if only they got the alpacas a few thousand years earlier. Maybe they could have like
everything would have changed.
Everything would have changed.
Right, because it was in Mexico. They actually had the wheel, the axle,
but they didn't use it for anything.
Right, they used it for toys. Good job, Mexico. Good job.
And like, that makes you think, you know?
Yeah, because you could make water wheels, and there's a bunch of stuff you could.
Do. According to Diamond, the Incans and the Aztecs have millions of people. There's a couple million people living in the Aztec and Incan empires. And
by his own
you're telling me the Incans don't have scribes at that point? They're more advanced than the Sumerians.
His whole argument for inventions later is that if you have a larger population and lots of food, and then naturally people will invent stuff.
The Incans had more metalworking than the Sumerians. They were able to metalwork with gold. Yet the Sumerians invented writing way before them. Kind of bizarre. Maybe it has something to do with a gene pool of sorts. A gene pool that's a result of environmental.
Racist?
maybe the environment influenced the genes of the human animals that lived there, and then they had different abilities to recognize patterns, and that led to differences in outcome.
I don't know. It's kind of like
Oh shit! Yeah, maybe we can't say that. So ridiculous.
Yeah, it's really bad when people try to fucking close their eyes to reality on that point. But
all right, chapter 11. Diamond talks about germs. So I found this one actually pretty interesting. That the reason that the Europeans had all these germs and stuff is because all the animals in your vicinity are filled with different bacteria, and the bacteria that started killing a bunch of us were the ones that sort of mutated from animals. So like,
he actually has a good table somewhere in the book. I'm trying to find it right now, which just lists all of the major diseases and what animal they stem from. That was pretty interesting, I thought. I mean, it's at least, what was it? Yeah, measles, tuberculosis, and smallpox was from cattle, and then the flu was from pigs, pertussis, and I don't know what that is. And then malaria from birds, which I don't know. That's mosquitoes later, but whatever.
The so like smallpox came from cattle, right? And then I think that's the one. I'm not sure.
But yeah. I'm looking at the table right now.
Yeah,
it's
and so the cattle had this disease, this bacteria. It mutated into smallpox and infected us. A bunch of people died, and then we became inoculated because that's how disease works. Like once people start getting it, they sort of get defenses themselves, and everyone gets it to a certain degree, and then they're inoculated.
And everyone who does not have the the genetic makeup to develop that freaking defense dies. So that's one major thing. He tries to claim that the germs didn't kill us, but it killed them. It's like, no, tons of people had to die in Europe too for us to be inoculated from them because of the wheat had to be cut from the chaff, so to speak.
Yeah. So not besides that, like, so the high density high food production population societies had these bacteria from the animals transmitted to them. It had large kill-off effects on these societies, and then these societies who are close to each other all the time had to evolve defenses genetically to deal with these diseases, and they did, and that took a long time.
Again, it's not so much that everyone developed it. It's sort of the concept that you don't have to outrun the tiger. You have to outrun the person next to you. Like it was the weak people that got cut off.
All right, but I think before I continue on the germ stuff, there was something he said in chapter 11 that was like really stupid. It was about like military history.
Oh.
I can't remember exactly what it was. Hold on. Let me pull it up.
Well, you remember what it was about? I can try to search too.
It was like right at the beginning of chapter 11. I all I have here is like...
What is it? Was it about all our armies using germs? Well, not using them, but it was modern military, not modern, but military in Europe victory not being based on prowess, but really just who could infect the most people.
Oh yeah, that statement. So he's like, oh well,
yeah,
all of the military technology of Europe and Asia was meaningless, and it's just like you should probably read Arthur Frill's book about Stone Age Alexander.
Yeah, I noticed that too. It was dumb.
Yeah, so
I mean, of course it's got some effect, but it's not going to win you a war.
Yeah, because I mean, Diamond is he's very prototypical sort of neoliberal view of things, and he hates like war and like war bad, military bad, and so he makes like stupid statements like, oh well, if it wasn't for the germs, it would have just been like CK2. Sunset Invasion.
Right. The armies don't even do anything. It's all the germs.
Yeah.
Soldiers are just lazy and dirty.
I'm sure without the germs it would have been harder, but definitely Europe would have easily won.
Oh yeah.
They just had to send more people.
It would have just taken longer,
Mhm.
but it would have still, yeah, it would not have. They couldn't stop us.
And that shows later when after the Indians sort of get used to the disease, and then they get cucked by the American pioneers. All right. So we already talked about how most of the modern infectious diseases can be traced back to domesticated animals, and then he talks about something that I found kind of spooky, where there's different microbes from animals that are common that we have and have not mutated yet. So we have them from a long time ago, and they just never have turned into an infectious disease. We just sort of have them, and it's kind of spooky that we're carrying these microbes that might at any minute evolve and just fucking kill us.
Yeah, but that's been the whole thing with germs in general. It's been a constant arms race between us and them,
Yeah.
and it will always be that. I mean that to me is a fascinating side of science. The fact that germs are this completely different organism that just like us fights for resources and tries.
And he
to
talks about that
procreate
in the chapter, have the germs point of view.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Exactly. It's fun to read about that. Those are good chapters.
Yeah, and I agree with that part of it. And then he talks about 95% kill rate in America, and millions of Native Americans died. Were there really millions of Native Americans?
99%. He uses 99% at some point too.
I'd have to look at some sort less biased archaeological evidence to really corroborate were there millions of Americans in the Incan Empire and the Aztec. But the thing is, if there were millions of people, natives, then that really kind of throws a wrench in his whole hypothesis. That if you have that much of a population density, technology should be developing.
Exactly.
Even if you have a slave class, you don't need domesticated animals. You can just have all your slave class do it. When you have that level of population, then you should be developing shit. But they didn't do it.
Just didn't do it.
It just didn't happen. Who knows? It's a mystery.
That's so weird because there's so many Thomas Edisons on Papua New Guinea, right? That's fucking that he uses that argument later.
Oh, there's one. I can't remember what chapter, but there's so he's working in Papua New Guinea, and he has his camp with all his modern Western technology. And then
they pick up his trash.
And he's like, "Oh, look at that guy." He's looking at my pencil, and he's like, "Wow, wouldn't this make a great earring, a pierced pencil earring?" He's like, "Eureka! What smart good boys they are."
Yeah, he actually writes "Eureka!" Exclamation mark after a long line.
It's just sort of the super typical pet black people thing, the white neoliberal academic who's these people are just as smart, and look how good. Oh, you picked up the can and you used it, put water in it. Oh my God, you're so smart.
So good, pat.
You're so pat on the head. God, I think nobody pointed that out to him because it would be racist, but.
And we don't want to be racist, Jeff.
We can't be racist here, yeah.
Right. So the next chapter, right? Because I think that was pretty much what was it, the animals?
Writing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Next one is writing.
Linguistics, boys. Yeah.
Oh yeah. This was so.
All right, so he's well, the Sumerians and the Chinese invented writing separately, and it just kind of happened. I mean, the Incans had a few million people living in the same place. It just didn't happen. It just didn't have writing. They
didn't need it. It wouldn't have.
I mean, they had agriculture, but they just didn't need writing. They had ropes and shit.
Yeah, they counted with ropes.
They had ropes with knots on them, but they couldn't write. Where'd the words go?
You just didn't need them, Jeff. You did fine without them. Clearly.
But don't worry, chat. I'm not gonna go fucking full autism on it. I even wrote a note to myself to mention that I'm not gonna go full autism on the linguistics. All right. So similar to how domesticated crops and animals spread around, and then people stopped bothering to try and invent new languages. The same thing kind of happened with the Sumerian language and then Chinese language. So the Chinese language spread, then it got slightly adapted by different societies, and then the Sumerian language spread, and both the Sumerian and Chinese writing systems sort of became the basis for all writing systems. And there wasn't really a reason to bother trying to invent new systems for writing after that.
No, I mean the stuff that I at least didn't know too much about was all the syllable stuff, the syllabisms, and the distinctions between those things, and then later on moving on to the alphabet.
So there's individual alphabet combinations. So you have different letters that make up words, and then the words mean different things, and the letters pronounce different syllables. There's syllable based languages. So Hanakana for the Japanese, they have all their syllables that they speak put out on. So I forget how many they have, 30-ish or something, 30 to 50 Hanakana, maybe less than that. And so
30 is low though, because that's not a lot of syllables to work with. So
I don't know. I forget. I don't know how many Hanakana there are. I know there's not that many. But basically, all they have just a little word that represents each syllable, a little symbol. And so using that symbol, you could then sound out any spoken word as an alternative way of writing it. So you have the syllable only way of writing it, and there's a few languages that are kind of like that, but not too many. And then there's the full-on chink mode, the full-on Chinese pictogram, logogram.
Yeah.
It's just a picture. It's like a little painting that means a word. And you just got to memorize thousands of them. Just get to it, boy.
Yeah, that was pretty funny with the one of the Native Americans, one of the Indians, that wanted to make. He wanted to.
Oh, that part was pretty funny. Yeah. So he talks about how. All right, so it's 1800 America, and the Native American's like, "Fuck, why don't we have fancy word? I want to write word too," and so. He
starts with the logograms, pictograms.
He tries to make logograms. He's like, nah, this fucking ain't working.
Yeah, this is too much. There's too much.
And then he's
I can't do it.
All right, so I'm gonna take this English book I found, this kids book, this children's grammar book, and I'm gonna just write down the random English letters, and those will become the syllables for my language. And what was funny is he wrote down the letter D, and it's pronounced ah or something.
It's completely lopsided from
it's our. He just wrote down the English letters at random and assigned random Indian sounds to the different letters. So D is ah and different stuff like that.
Yeah, it's. I mean, fair enough. He did do it. He did finish an entire alphabet for their.
I like the first attempt where he drew he was a blacksmith and he had different clients, and so he drew the face of the client, and then he drew
right.
He drew a circle and a line of different sizes, and he's like, I owe him a big debt. I owe him debt this big, holding out your hands like a fish or something.
And again with Jared Diamond's fucking twist on things, it's this guy was amazing.
He's like Indian Thomas Edison.
Just a smart.
The racism clearly. Of low expectations. Liberals are the real races. Ben Shapiro epic style ownage.
Epic. Next meme.
All right. So besides that, the earliest language is really inefficient. So basically, early Sumerian language, the only thing you could really write down is I owe Bob 25 cows. Or Bob 25 cows.
Yeah, it was Bob. It wasn't even I.O. It was just Bob 24 cows.
And it was purely used for just logistical reasons. And then artistry came later, notably from the Greeks. Most of the artistry or Western art popped out of the Greek fountain.
Yeah, because it was funny too that most of the things that were after having no like art in any of the writings, and then the Greek sort
Yeah.
all of a sudden came out with all art. It was what was the freaking what was it, a jug or
Yeah.
cup?
So the Greeks had a suddenly literally the earliest artifact with writing on it that the Greeks have. It's like a jug that says whoever wins it was like a sports competition or something. Whoever wins
Who
the
could
sports
dance the who's the
dance.
best dancer? Yeah.
Really? Oh, whoever
Yeah,
has
who's
the
the best
best
dancer?
Fortnite dance will win. Owns this wine jug, and that was what's written on the jug, and that was the first. That is the oldest art, the oldest Greek artifact.
That's kind of
Is
a
a
twist
jug
on
that
having
says
no.
whoever's the
Yeah.
best dancer owns this wine jug. Like just some bloke like down the street like wrote it on his wine jug and was like, hey, let's have a dance competition. And that's the oldest artifact.
Yeah. Well, someone was really happy about being able to dance since it actually survived that many hundreds of years.
Yeah,
Like this is a prized procession.
and it's sort of despite other places having high population densities. So like the Polynesians had high population density. The Incans, the Mesoamericans, they invented language, but it's very rudimentary, and it didn't really develop over the many years they had between then.
Yeah, it was mostly the high level guys in the it was very limited.
Yeah.
They didn't have widespread literacy.
Which was how the Sumerians had it for a while. So we really have the Greeks
Yeah.
to thank it that we're not all speaking Chinese right now, because otherwise we would be. Anyways, it still remains that it is the Europeans and the Asians who independently invented language. And it's like, oh, why did they independently invent language? Did they just have more scribes? I don't think that's really the case. I think it's something to do with pattern recognition, maybe. I don't know.
Well, you're starting to get into the intelligence territory. I thought we made this clear. There's no
Yeah.
such thing.
Like,
There's
why didn't
science
the
for and
Incans have
against
scribes? Maybe because
intelligence,
they're fucking dumb.
Jeff.
Why didn't Hawaiians have scribes? Because they're fucking dumb. They had the food. They had an aristocracy. They could have had scribes. They had enough
They had
food
an
for
empire.
scribes. They had empires.
Proto empire. Yeah,
Yeah, but they just didn't have them.
didn't happen. They
Just
didn't
didn't
need them,
have
Jeff.
They had enough food.
Fine
They
without
just
them.
never thought of it. They're like, oh, we don't need to keep track of this. It's fine.
I mean that is at least a bit of an argument, seeing as because I didn't know about the Phasos disc. That was a pretty interesting little.
Oh, that's the next chapter.
history
Yeah.
of Yeah. Oh yeah, no, right. That's the next one, the technology.
So he's talking in chapter 13 is all about technology and inventors and stuff, and his desperate attempt to sort of deny that genetics would have anything to do with inventing technology. And he opens it talking about the Phasatos, the Fiastos disc, which is this sort of weird
Phaistos.
artifact. Yeah. So there's this weird artifact found on Crete, which is the island in the Mediterranean of Greek origin, and it has a disc, like a very well done circular disc, and on it are imprinted a bunch of symbols that correspond to no known language, and they're clearly printed on it. They're not like written by hand. They're like stamped as if there was a bunch of wooden, carefully carved stamps imprinting on this tablet.
Yeah, so
on
it
this
was
disc.
clay too. So it was stamped and then it
And then fired, yeah.
hardened. Yeah.
And he's like, well, the presence of this disc means that like invention is just random. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It could come from anywhere. Meanwhile, this disc, which is using printing techniques well ahead of its time, is in, guess where? Europe. Makes you think.
Well, what do you know?
What do you know?
Yeah.
All right. So once again, starting this chapter, he's like, well, there's obviously no way that different people could have genetic intelligence. Then how come things get invented then? And then he starts talking about a bunch of random shit, like how the QWERTY keyboard is like a inefficiency that got stuck because of cultural norms and completely
that's a
unrelated
true story.
stuff. Yeah.
That's Yeah, it's
So I was like, oh well, he doesn't say, oh, the oil companies are suppressing the water car, but basically he goes on about different stuff like that. Not that the oil companies are suppressing the water car. There is no water car.
And then he tries to tear apart all the quote unquote famous inventors too. The whole hero.
Well, really,
mythology
they're
of
just building on other people. Now, he doesn't
Yeah.
mention the really creative ones, though, like Tesla or
Yeah, I was about to mention Yeah, exactly. He
like
just
Tesla, who's just like
glosses
some
over it.
fucking like Croatian autist who just like dreamed about electricity all day and managed
Yeah,
to build like crazy shit all the time.
Because his argument was too that in America they had economic incentive to do all these inventions, and then you have Tesla, who was a genius and died poor. Like,
Well, that's mainly from his own autism and retardation. But yeah.
fair. But that's still he was a genius inventor. So it was, I mean, still a Serbo. He was a Serbo-Croatian.
He was Serbian. I thought he was Croatian.
No, he lived in Croatia, but he was Serbian.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
Okay.
At least that's how. Yeah, he was Serb. Yeah,
Yeah.
Constantinus. Yeah.
And so basically, he goes to great lengths in this chapter to deny that IQ is genetically inheritable to 80%, which is like what the science says. And he just tries to deny it repeatedly. He's like, well, there's like a minutia chaos theory effect in the environment that like dominoes and that like causes like people saw like 12 trees and then they used 12 and in their numbered counting system. It's just like. It's like ridiculous. No, like the reason people are inventing different things is their ability, the mental processes they do per minute, right?
Yeah,
Like at the very least,
capacity for abstract thought.
the capacity to thought. And so, like, if we use, let's say we use the mental speed hypothesis from Stuart Ritchie's book, that IQ isn't really a measurement of like some like competency, but it's really just like speed of your neurons processing a complex idea. Then if you have a sufficiently high, imagine that you have like the Incan Empire, just have 1 million people, then you have 1 million people processing things should be invented at that point, right? If you have 1 million people's worth of processing power, and maybe, there's societal barriers and lack of education, but things, almonds should be activating, neurons should be firing.
Except they didn't.
And so what explains it, very easy explanation that sort of like there's tons of gaps in like his ability to explain his world history model, and the thing that conveniently fits in every gap that you just put the fucking the plaster in and just plasters over every gap. It's like, oh wait, what if environmental pressure selected for pattern recognition, and then
people were inherently biologically different.
Yes. Or the genetically selected for pattern recognition led to higher mental processing speeds, which led to more invention in certain areas, which is what happened. Because he sort of, another thing he says is like, oh, if only these people, if only the Aboriginals had like 20,000 more years, they would be fine. There's something to be said that like a certain place gets something the earliest. Like that's actually important. It's not, he kind of avoids that point. Like, why did the Sumerians invent language first? Is it because of just dumb luck? Or is it because they had higher genetic IQ leading to pattern recognition that allowed them to invent something as complex as language? Like maybe that's it, you know?
It is the innate ability because a country like Japan, the rate at which they shot up to like
the Meiji Restoration, the Meiji Restoration sort of destroys this book.
Right. And it's funny you frame it as you have the easy explanation for the whole thing if you count in genetics, and that's how he frames it, is that well the racist would just use the easy and simple explanation that inherent biological differences. Like he sees.
Yeah, you can't have easy explanations. You got to have Byzantine chaos theory, environmental only explanations, because obviously race is only skin deep. As he talks about his fucking New Guinean black pets being banned from eating people like 20 years earlier, and how like their children would get like brain juice on their hands and then get like a kuzu disease and go insane. I'm like, all right, yeah, totally.
Yeah, I mentioned the whole him appraising the New Guineans to a friend of mine, and the first thing he responded to in Discord was sending an article on the seaman warriors in New Guinea, like the New Guineans who thought they had to implant fucking sperm into the little kids to make them strong.
Oh, and don't even he like has this myth of like the super noble aboriginals. Doesn't mention all the fucking nasty shit aboriginals do.
Right.
Oh my god, the fucking child rape and shit. Oh fuck. Let's not mention that. Let's skim over that one. That's just a growing pain, Goy. Don't worry about those child rapes.
They didn't know better. Oh god.
They just didn't know. If they had agrarian society, they wouldn't rape kids. All right.
If they only had cattle and horses, then everything would have been fine.
The one point about technology I agree with him is that it does get sidetracked by random stupid shit. But like building better smartphones isn't helping us as a species to go anywhere except for like building social media is a bad technology. It's kind of like building the best giant gold statue. So there's a lot of pointless technologies, and I think he's right on that.
But did you mention smartphones in your copy?
No, I'm saying
okay.
I thought I was mentioning as a parallel to him saying that technology often isn't like a straight line, and it goes backwards and it's sort of idiosyncratic. Well, that's mostly because of the political makeup of societies driving technology into useless categories.
Yeah, because that's also how much surplus of resource do you have, because you need to have a sufficient amount of resources to waste in order to be wasteful.
Yeah.
We have too many resources now.
Chapter 14 is more of his sort of his tribal apologetics, where he talks about how darn egalitarian the the hunter-gatherer tribes of New Guinea are in comparison to our dang kleptocracy hierarchy. It's so bad. If only we could just live like these egalitarian hunters.
All we need is a big man to sort things out.
We just need a big man.
A charismatic big man to settle our differences.
Yeah.
I like the interview he did with the woman about her husbands. Like, oh, well, my first husband was killed by a guy, and then that guy was killed by the brother of my first husband, and then he was killed by another. Like, these people did not have pleasant lives.
Yeah, and he sort of he does temper it a bit. He's like, well, by egalitarian, I don't mean egalitarian. Hold on here, I'm being apologetic, but not that apologetic. But he's like, oh, their society doesn't have like arbitrary rent seeking. But it's like, no, like the big strong man, the big man. Not even the big man, just whoever's like the strongest man in the tribal community or the nomad community is going to have the most say and get the most resources. So it's not different than anything else. And this chapter annoyed me in particular because he starts going on about stupid fucking like Marxy bullshit about he's just talking about like the ills of modern society and such. It just comes off as so fucking shallow and stupid. It's just like the typical average neoliberal academic, where the average neoliberal academic is somewhere between being an anprim, being a socialist, and being a neoliberal capitalist. They don't have any actual beliefs, but they're just floating between different stances between these three things. So he's like, oh, these people aren't they having fun without all this technology? That's like anprim. And then like, oh, wouldn't it be better if we just distributed wealth more equally? It's just fucking nonsense. And it kind of sunk any opinion I had of the guy.
Yeah, the only light at the end of the tunnel for this chapter. This is where he kind of points out the flaws of Rousseau's whole social contract thing, that the people did not band together into societies because we just decided to all of a sudden like we're going to be farsighted and decide that it's better for everyone that we band together.
Was warfare and shit. It was the necessity of warfare, pressures. And that's what he says. And then that is corroborated by Arthur Farrell's book, where the fortifications almost came before farming, or in fact did come before farming. People would rather not be killed by like random roving bowmen than farm, you know?
Yeah. That's weird, right?
All right.
Why not?
All right, so chapter 15 is where he does massive apologetics for the Aboriginals.
Yeah, this is the whole part. Wait, is this part 2? No. There's
15.
something wrong with me.
Oh, part
Yeah,
4?
oh, yeah.
Oh, the trip
Yeah,
around
this
the
is
world.
part 4.
Where he's
Yeah,
like,
for
okay,
some reason my
so we
copy says
established
part
my
2, it's
hypothesis
not.
where everything is environmental, and now we're going to explore it. And so he's like, okay, well, the Aboriginals, they just didn't have enough plants. They just burn everything down. They didn't have any domesticatable animals. But even without,
They made
like,
it sound like such a like an actual strategy. Like, oh, they would do what was it, fire stick farming or whatever.
they
it
would
was
just
called.
burn like half the forest, and then it would grow back, and it would just. And meanwhile, like the evidence is that the Australia had a shit ton of forest, and the Aboriginals just fucking destroyed them, and they're not coming back. It's not all.
They
It's
were like,
they
they could kill the animals.
they made Australia into a desert. It was the Aboriginals, not it wasn't nature.
He because he also says, oh, it just made it all into grassland, so the kangaroos could flourish. And it's like, no.
Yeah. And then he avoids the topic of talking about Aboriginals in modern day Australia at any point. So he wants to avoid that, you know, about like sleeping in roads, and you don't want to talk about that.
Well, they just don't fit in. He's.
And this is where he makes that hilarious statement: if the Aboriginals had like 6,000 more years, then they'd be like on the level of the Sumerians in like 9,000 BC.
We should have waited. We should have given them those.
Yeah, that's the point I don't get from this book. It's like, what does he want Europeans to have done? Like, just like sit on their continent and let these people be like fucking ass backwards.
Right, because there's nothing in history that points towards them having been any different towards us if they would have run.
Yeah, like no matter who got the big gun German steel stick, they're gonna kill everybody.
Yeah,
if it wasn't us, it'd be the Chinese. You know, eventually the Chinese would have gotten over their boat hatred, and they would have gone and sailed and colonized shit. All right.
Was there anything else in this chapter?
Let's see.
It was pretty much all the Australian garbage, because this is the chapters where you kind of just start skimming a lot of it, because it's so sure, you can maybe give Diamond his argument where he's like, okay, so they just had really bad plants and bad geography, and that's why they didn't develop. But even so, like, if all humans are genetically intelligent on the same level, then the second you give somebody modern technology, they should be fine, right? That's sort of like the tone he takes. He's like, oh, the New Guineans, they're way smart. They're so fucking smart, the New Guineans. Oh, like they're picking through my garbage. They're Thomas Edison putting a fucking pencil in his ear. Whoa. It's just not true. No, that's not how it plays out. And he tries, because like you said, he does not go into Aboriginals. The only thing he mentions about Aboriginals in modern time is them being, they're being oppressed. They're being pushed into all the bad areas because the whites wanted the good areas to grow crops. But he doesn't mention that they don't function in our societies like at all.
Even given modern technology, they can't now farm or do anything really.
Right, because he does that one paragraph in the prologue where he says, "Oh, the Aboriginals routinely master industrial techniques when given the opportunity to do so." Like, no, not even the slightest.
All right, so then Diamond discusses China briefly. So he goes over sort of the ancient history of China and how it was a multiculture. And then the North Chinese sort of eradicated everybody and centralized them. And there's little pockets left over of different languages and genetic markers, like the Hmong and other people like that. But for the most part, very early on, like we're talking 200. We're talking like 200 AD. China was basically unified already.
200 BC
or 200 BC, yeah.
Yeah. So it started around 2000 BC that they.
Yeah. So China became unified extremely quickly, and had a unitary language that then spread to Korea and Japan, and then kickstarted their development. All right.
Yeah, and then that moved on to the all the other islands. Was it Austronesian? I never heard the word Austronesian before reading this book. It was a weird term. Because that's when he was talking about all the languages.
I think it's like it's a phenotype kind of thing.
Yeah.
So the early like a group that was in China before the Northern Chinese took over and homogenized everything. The Austronesians went south into Southeast Asia, and now they're all the Southeast Asians. And the Austronesians killed all the indigenous people there, except for the New Guineans, who Diamond loves.
There. Yeah, because they were a big island when they already had sufficient population density, and yeah.
All right, yeah. And so next chapter, China, he just goes over about like how it happened with the Chinese using aggressive, violent tactics to homogenize everything, and that's why they appear so unitary, because they used aggressive centralization tactics very early on, and that's true, and that's how they became so powerful.
Yeah, they mentioned the one emperor. That was pretty fun. I didn't know this about China. They had one emperor who basically said, "Okay, burn all the history books that we have
for a certain point."
Yeah, because they're useless now because I'm the big man. So
yeah, all those older history books, fucking burn them. We don't need them. We're writing new history.
Right, history starts now.
History starts now. Yeah. And basically, if you want to look at a rebuttal to Jared Diamond's hypothesis that everything is environmental, just look at the reactions of China, Japan, and Korea to colonization. You know? Because they got fucked just the same as the Africans.
Yep. It's
the Opium Wars, the Boxer Rebellion. Japan was ass backwards. Japan basically had nothing. They had just shitty wooden houses, and they farmed with basic tools.
They intentionally tried to go backwards for a period because I'd heard about them being backwards, but I didn't know that they had guns introduced to them, like way back, and then decided to
get rid of them.
Way cooler for it's way some samurai fights. Sword fights.
Sword fighting is way cooler. Let's get rid of these guns.
Exactly. That was yeah. But then the English came with the cannons, and they're like, okay, buy our shit or you die. Wasn't it the British?
No, it was the Admiral Perry opened up Japan.
Oh, okay. Never mind then.
All right, so he talks about the Austronesians, which is a group that used to live in China, but then got pushed out by the North Chinese, and they all they killed all the indigenous people in Southeast Asia, took over all the islands, and using their advanced technology of tying a canoe to another canoe, and able to not tip over, so they could travel long distances.
They were dugouts too. They weren't even like made. They were trees that they felled and then dug out.
Well, I mean the native indigenous people only had dugouts, but the Austronesian Chinese, the early Chinese who left, had pontoons, which is you just take two dugouts and you tie them together, and then you have a stable boat.
Amazing.
And this advanced technology allowed them to run around, get all the resources, kill all the natives, and they just shat on everybody. And then you could see this in all, and he talks about like how you could see this. You can just see this in all like the different languages and the genetic markers, and like, why do all the Southeast Asians look just like Chinese people? Well, it's because they colonized it from China.
Right, they took over that shit.
And I think a thing that all liberal historians do is avoid talking about Islamic colonization. I thought he probably should have talked about that one here, because it's pretty relevant for the area. Oh, and another thing that he conveniently never talks about, India.
Doesn't mention India.
It doesn't mention India, which has, like all the crops, all the food, like the breadbasket of the world, like huge population density, in the middle of everything. Great trade port. Don't mention it in the book ever. Just don't. It doesn't exist. Go away.
Let's see. I'm gonna do Control F. How many times has he mentioned India? Here we go. Oh, it doesn't give me a number. Damn it.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3. Yeah, he mentions India twice in the entire book. I think. Yeah. It's
all right. So besides the Southeast Asians, he then goes on to talk about how the Europeans conquered the Native Americans, which, I mean, it's all redundant at this point. Like, we already know, like, they had more technology and they won. That's basically, you don't even need to read this chapter.
Which chapter? Sorry.
18.
Oh yeah, 18. Yeah, 18. I would say actually, if you wanna read this book without reading all of it, just read this chapter.
Read chapter 18. That's like its central hypothesis, because he just reiterates everything that he's gone over before about all right. So the environment and the crops and the domesticated animals, they had a head start and they had more technology. They came in, they killed everybody, and then the germs won. If they didn't have the germs, they would have put up a fight. They just kind of.
Yeah, and the whole west east north south axes, and it's all in here. You could do this chapter and just add a bunch of references to literature.
All right.
And you'd have
the new information comes in chapter 19, where he talks about Africa, which he's been avoiding for most of the book.
Yeah.
And here he talks about how something a bit unrelated to his hypothesis, that there were the Pygmies and the Kosians, who were sort of hunter-gatherer. The Pygmies are, the very tiny, sort of red-skinned African people, and then the Kosians are these weird, like, I think you might, like, they're like the weird yellow, brown, whitish kind of people. The Khoisans, yeah.
Yeah. Because the Khoisans was wiped out by the Bantus, and I think it's kind of funny. That's also a conclusion he kind of skims over. It's like, oh, we don't know how they disappeared. Like, maybe they were killed a little bit. But
no, yeah, they were killed. Okay, so the North African Bantus came around the hook of West Africa, took their crops with them and their cattle, and then they basically just, using their better farming and tools, they just shot over all the Khoisians and killed all of them. But they stopped north of the river that separates South Africa and the rest of Africa. Yeah, and then and then the Dutch settlers get there, and then they kill the Khoisans, and then the Bantu are like, hey, wait, we want that land too. And so it's ridiculous. So neither the modern day blacks in South Africa have no ancestral claim to the land, and technically the Europeans got there first in terms of eradicating the native population. So
yeah, I have heard though that they did not. They traded with the Khoisan, and the rest of the Khoisan was wiped out by Bantu.
That is, so, I have to look into it, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, I've heard that 2 different places, and then also in the Farmlands documentary by the Lauren Southern, the coal burner.
Yeah. So humorously, the little neoliberal fucking narrative.
Yeah, someone else mentioned Khoisans worked with the Dutch.
I imagine they did. Yeah, I imagine the Dutch didn't get there and just kill all these people. I mean, they were like really backwards native hunter gatherers, but I imagine the Dutch didn't like go out of their way to bother too much.
Just wanted to farm, bro.
Thought it was the Zulus that wiped them out. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure too. That's the consensus. It's the Zulus, which are the Bantus.
Yeah, so he talks about how the Bantus developed a bunch of metalworking, but they didn't develop any actual lasting societies, even though they had metalworking. They just had these sort of like roving, big empire. Well, empire in air quotes. They just had a military force that sort of lived off the land and their agriculture, and then collected gold and shit. And they had like these kings. And then they would harass all the different trading African cities on the coasts. And that was the Bantu Empire. Despite having steelworking, didn't really do much of it, besides kill all the natives like the Khoisians.
It's worth mentioning they
had cattle, yeah.
Animals. Yeah, cattle. Because that was one of the big what was it, disparagements between the.
But it did take a
Khoisan
while
and
to
the
get down there,
Bantus.
but still, like, you had time.
Yeah, it's also they couldn't move down through the equator until the climate changed and the
Yeah.
what was it, the rainforest kind of withdrew.
A funny point he points out is how, like, linguists have found that the Semitic languages kind of came out of Ethiopia. The spoken linguistic roots of Hebrew, and then thus all the Semitic languages came out of Ethiopia. But I have to actually confirm that. It's kind of like an offhand comment he made.
Right. I mean, I don't know
Yeah.
about those languages. I don't know.
Yeah, so basically, he just keeps repeating himself. So, like, at the end of chapter 19, he's like, okay, so yeah, the Africans, the Bantu were pretty good, but they just were not as good, so they got shat on. But don't worry, it wasn't because the Eurasians had a higher IQ. It was because they had more food. And they had more food because of their environment. So don't you think for a second that the Bantu are worse at all.
They're better.
They're better, dumb,
Yeah.
racist, white, colonialist. Yeah. It's just so retarded, right? Because, like, his whole hypothesis is that, oh, well, these horses, pigs, cows, and plants have better genetic compatibility with human agriculture. What about the humans who have better genetic capability with technology? Like, you can argue that IQ isn't a good thing, or that our technological society is bad, but just say you're a fucking amprimp. Stop dancing around it like a neoliberal faggot, right?
Exactly. But
I would respect Diamond more if he just said, I think all our modern technology is just bad and materialist, and I just want to be an amprimp. Like, if you said that, okay, sure. And then you can deny that IQ has any value, but if you still want to use your fancy medicine and your fancy technology, then yeah, IQ is pretty important.
it is. I don't know. He uses he references the Nazis quite a bit too. Like, he really doesn't like Nazis. He's kind of in that whole scared mode. Like, if we look at biological differences in humans, then we're basically Nazis, and we shouldn't be that because they're bad. Nazis bad.
But the thing is, like, you can accept that there's genetic differences predisposing people to the civilized activity of, like, sedentary societies, or succeeding in them, or inventing things in them, and you could do that without, like, saying, oh, okay, I guess we need to have a genocidal eugenics program right now. Like, exactly. You can accept that fact and study it as a scientist. And, like,
but
make
people will constantly link those two together. Like,
yeah,
that's what Jordan Peterson does too.
Exactly.
It's like, if you engage in identity politics, then we will kill everybody.
There's this very clearly outlined, very real thing that IQ is genetic, passed down from your parents, 80%. Races have different IQs. It's measured by many things. Okay, that means races have different genetic IQs, and IQ is just a measurement. It's an arbitrary testing measurement, but it indicates some sort of pattern recognition that is useful in technological society. And this is true. And you can
I'd add too, specifically with the trait that it shows. It's what sets us apart from fucking all the other animals. Like, the ability for abstract thought is...
Yeah, without pattern recognition, we're basically just dumb animals mimicking things.
That's why we are the king of the jungle. It's
and so he just if you deny this fact, which is what Diamond does, he just denies it outright in the prologue of the book, many times throughout the book, goes through all these hoops and these hoopla. We're on to the epilogue now, or he's just talking about all this stuff.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the epilogue. I had to skim through that too because
he just talks about well China just had some internal politics problems, so their technology fell behind, didn't colonize, and he goes Europe was
so fucking left and right on
Europe was decentralized, so that's why they had enough competition to support the risky venture of sending Columbus across the sea, and that's why they were able to reap the rewards of colonization and therefore advance their technology even more. Which I guess, yeah, sure, yeah. China is basically decentralized Europe for centralized China, and sort of the classic tale. And then he talks about
the idiosyncrasies of historical leaders too, because this is where he also goes into
this is where he does a
Hitler.
little rant about Hitler for some reason.
Yeah,
Like
if only somebody had killed Hitler, then we wouldn't have any, like, we would have.
And he talks about how he wants to establish a historical science, but it's all environment, and that the things that actually cause all the different differences in history, that they're so minute and they'd be like nigh impossible to trace. But I think we could do it. We could chaos theory reverse engineer the domino and find like the bush that one guy saw that make sure that we had a numeric system. Like fucking, it's ridiculous.
And he points out how ridiculous that thing is too. At some point in the book, I remember it was early on that historians basically keeps trying to find the first thing and then the thing before that and the thing before that.
Yeah. You're not ever going to get the first principles, and intelligence basically explains everything he couldn't explain. And like, say what you will about intelligence. I mean, you could say you're welcome to have a point of view that says IQ is arbitrary. It should not decide our social activities. You're welcome to say that. But to deny its existence is pseudoscientific, and then in this book is pseudoscientific, and then the books that follow its lead are pseudoscientific because they deny. It's like you build a house and then you take out all the doors and windows. And it's like, what's the point? It's just a basic fact of anthropology that genetic differences have effects on society and environments and peoples. And then IQ is one of them.
I'd add too that it's well worth someone's time to discuss how we got to that higher IQ.
Yeah, it's trying to look at the different environmental factors that led to the Asian and European populations developing higher pattern recognition ability thousands of years before anyone else. Like, what were the environmental factors that led to that?
Hypothesis.
Yeah, the winter hypothesis and such.
Yeah, that's one of them. That's one of the big ones.
This is the guy who did start the trend of denying genetics and anthropology, and so now you just have like this anthropological underground where like all the basic genetic information is hidden because it would imply that race is real.
Can't do that.
You can't say that. And it's just so stupid. Because like he'll say one thing that basically indicates maybe race would explain this, and he's like, but they just didn't have enough food, but they're also population dense and basically a proto empire, but they didn't have enough food. I'm like, all right,
didn't have enough
food
to invent stuff, but they did, and yeah, he.
And so the book I didn't like it, obviously, but I think the facts, he does good research. He assembles a shit ton of facts. They're pretty well recounted, a lot of the facts. I learned a decent amount from this book. But he is biased, he is unscientific, and he has ruined whatever he attempted to do here by his biases, by not looking at the whole picture, but not even attempting to look at a major factor of human genetics. And no matter what the outcome is...
Well enough.
Yeah. And the literature on that says, oh, well, IQ is genetic. And you got to look at that implication of that. You got to look at how that would have developed over time and how that affected things. There's just so many examples that sort of destroy this book, which is like the Meiji Restoration. So Japan had a literate society. The elite were literate, the peasants were not. But they were just basically a super old medieval society. Sure, they had centralized government and food and all these things and metalworking. But they're shit-ass backwards. They'd love to get even mild amounts of Chinese technology. Admiral Perry opens up the isolated country. 50 years later, they're an industrial warring powerhouse with modern... with a modern military able to stand up to European powers. Which is ridiculous. A major world player. So
from 0 to 60 and.
So why don't when we get to New Guinea and we say, oh hey, New Guinea, here's all these technologies like electricity and generators and fossil fuels, like hey, New Guinea, here's all these things. They're like, oh, well, I'll pick up can and put water in can and put pencil in ear.
Yeah, there was one
Like,
story he said with the guy who coffee beans. Like, oh, there's one guy in New Zealand who would sell a lot of coffee beans, and he would buy a lot of trucks, and that was the best case he could come up with. Which, I mean, yeah, they didn't. Yeah, sorry, keep going.
Yeah, like if you take the rural backwards populations of Europeans and Asians and you give them technology, they tend to form societies. If you give it to Africans, Aboriginals, and South Americans, they do form societies, but they're dysfunctional or on the verge of collapse. So that this book doesn't explain that at all. He'll say, oh well, systematic colonization and the legacy of imperialism and all this nonsense.
They were oppressed.
But meanwhile, imperialism is how all the fucking plants and shit spread and how all this got kicked off in the first place. And how societies even began to form. So I don't know. It's just that basically he doesn't know what he believes. He doesn't really have a moral system. He's just a modern liberal. Why is this book so popular with boomers and magapeds? Because it basically
they can point towards a bunch of facts and go, "Hey, there's no genetics here, goy."
Basically, it's a desperate attempt to avoid human genetics, and it is well sourced. I mean, it has a lot of facts about history, and for sure,
a plethora of facts. Yeah,
and for sure, I agree that the plants and the animals available to different human populations affected their eventual development and their success. But that is in addition to their IQ. Like, you need IQ in order to take advantage of these things. Like it's like a function of environment plus food plus genetic capability. And he basically chops off the leg of genetic capability, and he has a model that just falls down.
Leaves it completely out of the equation. Yeah.
And so it's basically... It's a frustrating book because it does present a lot of information, and if it was synthesized with genetics, maybe it could actually get at some truth of things. But because of the goofy, cultish, like denial of reality to try and say that all races are real, race is skin deep, that there's no cognition, that there's no physicality, that a different level, different types of cognition are not genetic in any way, and that's racist. You can't say that. Basically ruins it. And it ruins much of science and anthropology and history and everything. So this book is sort of endemic of like the modern academic neoliberal viewpoint, making science bad and unusable. And that's basically what I got out of it.
Yeah.
All right.
And it's badly written too. I want to add that.
It
could
does
really cut 200 pages out of it.
It does really not flow, and it repeats itself too much.
Yeah. Definitely. So it's pretty inaccessible. You can point towards it and know that not everyone's gonna want to fucking slog through it and see if there's anything to criticize in it, which there is. Yeah,
and we did, and we slogged through it, and I criticized it, and the criticism is basically that genetics is real. Sorry.
Sorry, not sorry.
Sorry, not sorry. See ya. Yeah, well, thanks for tuning in, I guess. Actually, what day is good for you? You wanted to read Spinoza Ethics, right?
Well, Sunday would
okay, I could do Sunday.
Best. Yeah.
Sure. So we'll aim for Ethics by Spinoza on Sunday. That'll be a fun read.
Hell yeah. Proving God with Euclidean geometry. That'll be good.
Yeah, that'll be a spicy one. All right, see you guys. Thanks for tuning in. And tame zebras.
Peace out.